Good morning. Um, I'd like to talk about gathering and using supporting materials in support of your speech. Um, Certainly, as we've talked about before, the supporting details support your main ideas, which ultimately support the central idea. And we do want your supporting details to be interesting. Nothing worse than a boring speech with a lot of, boring details like, overuse of statistics, which, people don't retain in their short-term memory very easily. And again, your supporting details need to be comprehensible to the audience. They need to be able to understand uh, the basis of what you're saying. I think I may have already shared an example of I had one student who gave what could have been a brilliant um, explanation about computer and internet encryption, um, and it might have been a great presentation to a computer class or people who are more knowledgeable. He gave it in our class, and I, including myself, I wasn't able to follow it because I didn't have the background knowledge required. And so again, always assess your audience, what they can understand. Um, there are many sources of information. I know everyone's go-to is Google, and we'll talk about that. Um, but I like to start a little old school with old-fashioned books. Um, I know encyclopedias are considered old-fashioned, uh, but they have lots of great information. Um, there, of course, are online encyclopedias too, and that's fine. Um, Atlases for showing maps. Uh, if you're trying to explain something, geographic, they're helpful. Directories of all sorts. Um, Almanacs and yearbooks, and by yearbook I don't mean like your high school yearbook, and they probably don't have these anymore, but they would come with encyclopedias. uh, they would share a whole range of things that would be have occurred over a period of a year. It might be in the area including business, politics, economics, natural things, sports, entertainment. um, you could imagine what a yearbook of 2020 might include. Also, books of quotations. I'm particularly partial to Bartlett's Book of Quotations. So if you're looking for a quote to sort of support, something that you're talking about, or something that maybe you want to put a little spice into it, Bartlett's is a good book. But there are other books of quotations as well. But Bartlett's has almost everyone from Socrates and Aristotle to Scotty from Star Trek, and everyone in between. Of course, there's several pages devoted just to Ben Franklin, who's often quoted. Um, Obviously, biographies, which we've talked about. If you're giving a speech about a person, that would be helpful. Um, Various periodicals, and by periodicals we mean things like newspapers. If you go into a library, you can ask for the stacks. That's where they stack the newspapers. Um, of course, also magazines. Magazines will tend to have more feature articles. Newspapers are like what just happened yesterday, that sort of approach. Magazines usually have more of a perspective because they usually will come out weekly or monthly, as opposed to newspapers, which tend to come out daily. There are also trade journals, and trade journals could be in newspaper format or magazine format, but they probably follow a publishing schedule closer to a magazine. And they are usually sponsored by trade organizations. And for almost any field, every occupation, every industry, there are trade journals, and these are professional, targeted towards professionals in that. So every field has it. There's the medical field has several trade journals, marketing, agriculture. My postal carrier gets a kick out of about once a month. I receive 3 trade journals: National Hog Farmer, Pork and Swine Veterinarian magazines, and this is because I used to service those industries. And so I got these subscriptions. I've told them that to discontinue it. They're free, but I've told them to discontinue it. But they still send it to me because I guess they want to keep their subscription numbers. But it's amusing. But every field has it. Excuse me. There are also government documents that you can request under the Freedom of Information Act, if you have the time for that. Also, there are many databases, both governmental and private databases. As students at the college, you are entitled to get access to certain databases, which the library has set up. And excuse me. So if you go to the library, you can go to the library building, or you can go online, and if you go to the library website, they should be able to tell you how to access these databases. These databases, while they are online, they are not generally accessible to anyone who goes online, and generally you're going to get a better depth of information than going to Google. And I'll talk more about Google in a moment. Obviously, most of you will go to the internet and you will go to Google. Let me just say, actually, a moment, word about Google. And this particularly goes to citations. And I cringe when I see in a citation somebody puts google.com. There's almost nothing on Google. Google is a search engine which points you to other websites. And they've recently started pulling stuff onto it, like mostly from Wikipedia. That's not their content. So I would never want to see Google listed as a citation. It is not a proper citation, because it's like saying whatever. I couldn't be bothered writing the citation down, so I just write down Google. I mean, I love Google. It's a great tool, but it's not a citation. So various websites that you may want to get information from would be association websites. Many of these associations publish trade journals, as we just talked about. Various government websites. It's amazing what is available on the government websites. For my first book, I did a lot of research, primarily on government websites, and it was very helpful. They publish quite a lot. There are other websites you may go to as well as appropriate. But if you don't find something on a website, you might email an expert. No guarantee that they'll respond, but I actually had success doing that, and I'll refer to that coming up. There's Wikipedia, the red X of death over Wikipedia. I like Wikipedia. I'm not saying I don't. However, there is a serious problem with Wikipedia. Well, two actually. First off, nobody edits. There's not a significant amount of editing on Wikipedia. There's no authoritative person checking the accuracy. In addition, anyone can change Wikipedia. Anyone can go in and edit Wikipedia without any qualifications. And that's the problem. I have actually edited Wikipedia pages on multiple times. And when Wikipedia first came out, it had no citations, and this is what particularly upset college professors. It was just, and I like the idea of a wiki, which is basically people coming together and donating information about a topic. However, it can lack a certain credibility, so you want to be careful about that. To Wikipedia's credit, they started a number of years ago asking for citations. So if you put in information, they'd like you to provide a citation, although it's not a hard and fast requirement. Almost any time that I have edited Wikipedia, I have also put in a citation. Only one time did I not, and that is because, I'm sorry, excuse me. The only time I didn't was actually when it was a page on a particular football player who I actually knew. I went to high school with him. His name was Sid Kitson, and I just filled in some information about him that wasn't already there. I didn't give anything too personal. I simply say what high school team you played on, a couple other details. But generally, I would never want to see a Wikipedia page as a citation. Another source are blogs. I'm going to put the red X of death on that one too. Blogs are generally opinions. For instance, Huffington Post, a significant part of the content there are just blogs by people. Now, if you're trying to quote somebody who you know is an expert and they have a blog, that's fine. You could say, so-and-so said on their blog, this thing. And the same thing for like tweets. You would never use that as a source unless you're quoting someone. And a lot of people, of course, lately have been quoting President Trump's tweets for better or worse, whether they like them or dislike them. And that is sort of evidence of that person saying it. So that's sort of a fact. But I would never. So it's good for saying this person tweeted this. You're stating a fact. But it doesn't mean whatever that tweet is, regardless of who it is actually true, because it's like a blog. It's somebody putting out, and actually any social media post, you could use it as a source as this person said this, but the information is not necessarily verified because there's no editor. There's no person verifying the veracity of it. Facebook, in recent years, and if you've been paying attention to the news, it's mostly in regard to political stuff, generally doesn't edit. Just the other day, I heard that actually Mark Zuckerberg has said that any information that denies the Holocaust will be removed. But there's a lot of other false information on social media, on Facebook and other sites. So we want to be very careful about that. Only as evidence to do that. And also, interesting things like tweets and other things can be removed. So if I'm ever citing a tweet, I actually do a screen capture of it to prove that it was, actually true. Because I remember I quoted, I referred to something, and that person removed the tweet. So then I could no longer cite it because it doesn't exist anymore. And that is one of the dangers of citing online sources is they can be taken down very easily. And then all of a sudden you've lost the connection to the reference, the citation. Online videos, again, you have to be very careful. A lot of people do video blogs, and that's kind of the same thing as regular other blogs and other social media accounts. However, if they are evidence of something, that's a little bit different. In fact, in a future lecture, I will be using an online video, which is the evidence of an event that occurred. So that's fine. But if it's just simply somebody blogging, video blogging, or saying, and it's not a proper news source. I mean, if it's an online video of a professional newscaster like somebody from NBC or some other network, that's that could be okay. But again, this comes to evaluating your sources, which we'll talk about shortly. If you give online references, you have to use the specific URL. Occasionally I see people say, well, it's the reference is CNN.com. Well, CNN has literally millions of pages. There's no way I'm going to be able to find. That would be like finding a needle in a haystack. So you have to put, CNN.com / all the gobbledygook that comes afterwards. So somebody can actually go to that specific page. Internet citations are not the best because they can disappear. Where if it's a citation from a book or a publication, a periodical, those are more reliable sources. I understand during the pandemic, people are less inclined to go to the library, and I understand. Another source, of course, is interviewing experts, and I referred to emailing experts. And so you can go and interview them either on the phone or in person. I tend to go in person if I can. Actually, not always, but So let's talk about interviewing somebody. Um, People generally will be open to sharing information with you. I mean, provided there's not a reason you're not trying to keep it secret or something, or you're interviewing them over something embarrassing. That can be very helpful. I had, excuse me, a particular issue. I was doing some. I needed to do some research for. I was consulting for a biotech company, and I needed to. I'm not a. Even though I've worked for pharmaceutical companies, I am not a scientist in any way. I've picked up some stuff along the way, but I'm no expert. And I had to learn more about the area of pharmacokinetics, and that's how the body and a drug, pharmaceutical, interact with one another, how they change each other. Um, and I looked at a couple textbooks, but it was over my head. I just didn't have the time, so I needed to get an expert to, uh, you know, explain the things that I needed to. And so what I did is I emailed about 30 experts, and I got one response. And if that person hadn't responded, I would have gone out further, emailed more people. There's actually a very nice gentleman from Rutgers University, worked in their one of their science colleges, and I set up an appointment to come visit him. Anytime you do that sort of thing, you need to figure out what information you want from the interviewee ahead of time. You really need to prepare. So you do your research beforehand, and so you don't waste the time of somebody. For instance, let's say for some reason, somehow, you have wangled a 20 minutes with Barack Obama, and you can ask him anything you want. You don't want to waste that opportunity. You don't want to say, "Oh, Mr. President, could you explain to me how the three branches of government work, that whole checks and balances thing?" That's information you can get in any textbook. You can get it in, I'm sure many of you will get it from online sources. You want to ask him or anyone things that only they can answer. For instance, I was doing research on my first book, and I had come into contact with a certain congressman who is now a former congressman. But one time, he would come for these. I used to be an Eagle advisor in the Boy Scouts, and I would sort of manage the ceremonies, and often this congressman would come and give awards and say help that way. And I was thinking about, well, I could speak to the congressman, because I was writing a lot about the House of Representatives. And I spoke to his aide, and they never go anywhere alone. They always have an aide with them. I said, I'm working on this book, and it'd be really helpful to maybe if I could speak to the congressman sometime. He said, well, what do you want to know? It's why I haven't worked that out. Well, and I said, I don't want to bother him today, because I don't want to waste his time to do some research, and then I'll beforehand, and then I would maybe ask to speak to him. And he said, oh, sure. He gave me his card. I said, maybe his chief of staff could help you instead. But if you really need time with him, and so I did a lot of research. And in fact, I did so much research, I didn't have any questions left for him. I mean, it would have been nice to talk to him, but I didn't really want to waste his time, and I wanted to be respectful. So there's a lot of stuff can be handled that way. In the case of the scientist, I did as much research as I can, and then I contacted him, and he was very willing to help me. So I planned my questions ahead of time, and what I tend to do, if I can, is I actually type out my questions on a piece of paper and leave space below it in between questions, so I can just fill in. It makes it a lot easier for taking notes. I don't know shorthand, so I have to do it that way. If you're going to, interview somebody in person, you want to dress appropriately. depending upon who I'm interviewing, for instance, if I went to go interview that congressman in person, I would have worn a full business suit. For the scientist, I just wore, a shirt and a sport jacket. You always want to be seen professional. Um, you know, that means showing up on time, being respectful of time. Usually ask for a certain amount of time. For the scientist, I asked for 30 minutes. And I said, well, I asked you for 30 minutes and I don't want to overstay my welcome. And he said, oh, no, no, you've been very nice. And, he gave me more time. And because of that, I actually had to go, when I had more, I learned more and applied more of what he told me. I called him and asked him for some more time. And he was very accommodating. Um, I said I dressed appropriately. He was in shorts and t-shirt, and that's fine because he's the one being interviewed. Um, you might want to record that, but ask first. I actually have, I don't know if you can see, I have a little recorder. It's an Olympus recorder. I particularly like it. It has a US, and if you can see it, it has a USB port, a USB plug, and so I can plug it into my computer. Um, so, um, but certainly ask first. You don't want to be like just putting this on the desk and recording. That's kind of rude. Ask, of course, first. Never, under any conditions, should you record someone surreptitiously. In many jurisdictions, it is illegal. In the state of New Jersey, I believe, and I'm not a lawyer here, but I believe you can. It's a one-party state in that if one party knows they're being recorded, they can record a conversation. However, it is rude and unprofessional. I do know of somebody who did that. She brought in, it was an old Sony Walkman. This was many years ago, before the digital recorders. She brought in the Sony Walkman, and she had it, on her belt, under her jacket, and she recorded the conversation. And then there was this loud click, because if you remember, when it came to the end of the tape, it would stop. It had a clunk, and the idea is you take the tape out and turn it around, and you record it in the opposite direction. The person being interviewed said, "Excuse me for a moment." He stepped out, and a minute later, 2 security guards came to escort her out of the building, and she was never allowed in the building again. Don't record people. It's really unethical without their knowledge. But if you ask most people, and then you say, "I'm not going to publish this. I'm using it for accuracy." Even if you do that, you need to take notes. And the reason you want to take notes is, first off, technology will fail you from time to time, and it never happens at a convenient time. But also, it keeps you more involved. It shows you're paying attention. You're not just recording. Also, occasionally in your recording, there may be something said that maybe the person points to something or like that, and if you're taking notes about that, it helps. Also, let's say it's a long recording, and you want to say, I know halfway through, roughly, they said something, but you want to verify it. Instead of having to play through the entire recording, you play through, you go halfway through, and you find what you're looking for. So your notes can kind of be an index. Also, occasionally something visual needs to be recorded. So that's good. All sources, well, not all sources are great sources. You want to evaluate them for accuracy and reliability. So does the source provide consistently correct information? Actually, I have, my head is full of useless trivia. I'm kind of a trivia buff. I can tell you all sorts of useless information. Hopefully, that's not what you consider what we get in class. But somebody, I think my sister gave for my birthday years ago, a book of trivia, and it was kind of cool and the odd facts. But then I discovered occasionally that things were wrong, things that I knew they had in the book that were incorrect, and I found that a lot. For instance, these clickbait websites often provide a lot of erroneous information. things that I know are wrong. And the question is, the stuff that I don't know, how do I know if that's true? I actually, without my telling my sister, I threw this book away because I didn't want to give it away, because I don't mind giving books away, but I didn't want to give a book away that had inappropriate, untrue information. So, um, and one way to deal with this is to verify with second sources whenever possible. This is actually something journalists do. If there's something, information they get from one source, and particularly if it's incredible, if it's inflammatory or in some way unusual, they verify with a second source. And this is what all reputable journalists would do. I recently saw on television one of these networks that are less than fully reputable, and but they did actually say, we don't have a second source on this, and they reported, I forget what it was, but it was. And I thought, wow, and they're reporting, and also the reporting of rumors is, I think, very dodgy. Uh, you know, track down the rumor, verify the rumor before you report it. But and you want to do the same, unless you're reporting that there were a whole bunch of rumors saying this, but there was no verification. Then you're just saying there's a rumor, but we don't know if it's true. And even that you might want to stay away from. Also, are your sources objective? You want to be careful of biases and agendas. And I know probably many of you will jump to the political agendas, but even non-political agendas. For instance, one source. Let's say you're doing a speech or report on milk, dairy, that sort of thing. You would maybe want to go to the American Dairy Association, which represents dairy farmers. They are going to be pro-milk. Now, it's an interesting thing about milk. My son, when he was much younger, he was trying to get swimming merit badge for the Boy Scouts, and he was having trouble with stamina. And so we tried to work with him, at the local community pool in the summer, and then he was still having trouble maintaining his stamina in the pool. Then he had to swim a certain distance. And so we hired a coach for one night a week for a few weeks, and the coach came to us and said, "Does your son drink a lot of milk?" And I said, well, "Yeah." I said, "Well, he needs to cut that out." This is because what's happening, he's cramping. That's why he can't maintain the stamina. And what it is, the lactic acid in his muscles are creating the problem. And so, wow. Now, that is not some piece of information you will find on the American Dairy Association website. The American Dairy Association is pro-milk. They're not going to show any or share any information that is in any way going to reduce the consumption of milk. And their agenda is to, get people to drink more milk. And the same thing, with the National Rifle Association or some other association. They're there to promote that product. And I'm not saying that they're lying, but they have a certain bias and they have a certain agenda. They're there to promote something. So you have to be careful about. You want objective sources, news sources. The databases, which I told you about, which are much more reliable than, certainly you want to be very careful of anything that's on social media for obvious reasons. The date in which something is published is also very important. And one thing is the information still current? When I worked in the pharmaceutical industry, one thing I did is I managed the creation of promotional literature. And because we're dealing with pharmaceuticals, where people's lives could be seriously affected. Any claims I made in let's say a brochure or anything like that, had to have a scientific citation, a scientific study. And so I kind of learned fairly quickly what I was allowed to say and what I wasn't allowed to say, but I still had to go and get support for that. And I would usually go to our technical support people, people with PhDs after their names. I'd say, okay, this is what I'm saying, which study. I mean, I could, after a while, I knew the studies, but I would go to them to verify that this study did support this particular statement. And there was one that frequently came up, a study that was frequently used. We called it the T-bone study. That was, I think T was his first initial and Bone was his last name. So we called it, everyone called him T-bone. And he did a scientific study, and it was done in 1972. And I said, well, don't you have something more recent? It seemed like, uh, I was concerned about how old the study was, and I was told, no, it's okay. This was a very conclusive study. It had statistical significance, enormous statistical significance. It was very, concrete in its result, and it's never been contradicted. There are other studies, but they were smaller studies, essentially to verify the T-bone study. So I was assured that the information was still current. Now, in science, that's not always the case. Certainly, studies about evolution and astronomy and physics have all changed, over the same period of time. But this particular one, it was a medical study, still held up. So you always want to check that, and if possible, get newer references, citations. But if it's old, it can still be valid, but you just want to check. Now, let's say if I got a citation and it was an article that had been in a magazine or newspaper, and the title of the article is "The Role of Women in American Society," you might have a general idea. Let's say it was published in 2015. You might have a fair idea of what would be in that article, the attitude that might be taken. Oh no, I made a mistake. It wasn't 2015. It was 1915. Well, then the content of that article would be significantly different. I think you would all agree. Or certainly probably would be. So the question is, should I throw that 1915 article out? Well, it depends. Is it still relevant, or can it be used as a historical reference? Even in the scientific area, you can say, well, in 1915 or whenever they believe this, that you can use it as a historical reference, but you may not want to use it as something that is currently reflective of the current thinking or the current understanding of a particular topic. So in evaluating sources, dates are important. So the source for objectivity and the date as to see if it's still current. Supporting materials for your speeches, can include illustrations. I mean, physical illustrations or metaphorical illustrations. They can be brief or extended illustrations. An extended illustration might be a story that you would tell. And stories are good sources as long as they bring you to that conclusion that supports your central idea. You can also talk about hypotheticals. Now, this may seem counterintuitive because a hypothetical is not something that's actually real. That's part of the definition of hypothetical. But you're saying something like, imagine a future where, for instance, I think you are all aware of the concept of the self-driving car. I think we now have some cars that are self-parking. I believe Uber Uber and Google and others have been testing out self-driving cars. And the idea is that you just punch in the destination and sit back and the car does the driving. And you don't have to worry about it. So imagine a future where we have achieved that. I know there have been some glitches, but assume, let's say they do that. We could project through this hypothetical what changes would occur. And usually in the class, I go around and let you all suggest what those changes are. But I will list some of them that have been discussed. Certainly, if you had self-driving cars, certain people who can't drive now could drive. For instance, older people, like, give my credit to my mother-in-law. At 92, she hung up the key. She said, "I don't think I can drive anymore. My vision is not what it should be." But she's 100 now. You know, if she had a self-driving car, she could probably get into it, punch in the destination, and it would take her there. Going in the opposite direction, younger people in the state of New Jersey, I think the driving age is 17. You get your learner's permit at 16. In other states, it's actually younger. But why couldn't, if it's a self-driving car, why couldn't a 12-year-old or a 10-year-old drive? Again, they punch in the address and it takes them there. So that could be. People who are disabled, people who might be blind or have some other disability, maybe they would use Braille, or maybe it would just be voice activated. One group that is certainly real concern: people who are inebriated, people who are intoxicated. And I have actually seen, this is sort of a cliche, somebody running their car into a tree. I actually witnessed that one time, and that would be something you would want to avoid, definitely. And with a self-driving car, if it's somebody who's drunk gets into a car, they might punch in the wrong address, but the worst thing would happen is they'd end up at the wrong address. Certainly, this would affect the job market. You might not have taxi drivers or bus drivers. It would be done in an automated way. So it would probably also reduce accidents. They found that generally, and there have been a couple accidents with self-driving cars, but for the most part, computers are more cautious drivers. They follow the rules of the road because they're computers. They have to. Strangely, one of the big things one of the big holdups is not in the technology, but in many of the manufacturers are waiting for Congress to make a decision about how they should program them. Which life is more important, the life of the people inside the vehicle or people outside the vehicle? And that's actually a decision a computer can't make. It has to be told which to value more. So that's sort of an interesting thing. One area I think there would be dramatic effect for, and a huge benefit would be long-haul trucking. One of the problems with long-haul trucking is that you have to get from point A to point B as quickly as possible, but still deal with the speed limits. And also, people who are driving for long periods of time, their driving can deteriorate. There is something called road hypnosis. The lines going by actually can hypnotize people. But also, people just get tired. People fall asleep at the wheel. Truck drivers under a lot of pressure because they have to get from point A to point B. They're told legally that they must stop rest for so many hours. A lot of these truck drivers don't do that because they're incentivized to get their trucks there quickly, to either speed or drive longer than they should. And there's actually a lot of falsification they have to maintain logs. There's falsification of those logs because of that. But you could see if somebody, you could still have a truck driver, but they didn't have to stay awake the entire time. They didn't have to become road hypnotized. They wouldn't have to rest. They could rest in the cab. And that would probably be a great thing. Now, all these ramifications that I've talked about, do any of them seem unreasonable? These are ones that actually students have brought up. They're all completely reasonable. Whether they'll happen or not is another thing, but and it carries a certain weight. We understand how technology changes people's behavior, so that would be a reasonable thing to do. even though none of that has happened. But we're projecting future, and it has a certain weight as long as it's logical. Um, good. You can also incorporate descriptions and explanations, and you often have to. Actually, just before I started this lecture, I was answering a student email asking about, I won't say what the topic was, but part of it is that you're going to have to explain what that is because not everyone's going to know. So you have to sometimes describe and explain things before you to make the point. Now, and you may even need to provide definitions. Just make sure that these, whether it's descriptions, explanations, or definitions, that it actually enlightens people and you don't use it as filler. Because filler, people's like they want to get their time up to a certain point, so they fill in stuff. Don't give definitions of things people already know. You can use analogies. We've talked about analogies previously, literal or figurative analogies. Statistics, again, don't overdo the statistics. And when you do use statistics, if you need to, you can round them off. So instead, you could say over 45,000 rather than 45,394. Again, this goes to chunking. 45,000, that's one or two chunks of information. 34,394 is 4 or 5 chunks of information. So again, if you want people to retain it. If you have to present a lot of numbers, you may want to use charts, a diagram, like a bar chart or a XYZ chart. Because if you're trying to show a trend, people aren't going to remember all the numbers. Like a table, don't use a table. But usually I would suggest not using a table, but using a chart where you could see a trend, whether it goes up or goes down, would be helpful, rather than the actual numbers. I mean, you certainly put a scale on it on your chart, but you can use opinions. Again, you want to be very careful about that. You certainly would want to use expert opinions. You can, in certain cases, use lay opinions, but they have to be relevant. It can't be just an average person's opinion. So let's say you were doing a presentation on plane crashes. You might want to include the opinion of an aerodynamic engineer. That would be your expert testimony. But you could also include somebody who's been in a plane crash. What does it feel like? So they're not an expert. Well, maybe they're an expert in being in a plane. I know that's not really still being an expert, but you can understand that. The odds of getting an aerodynamic engineer who's been in a plane crash is very remote. So you unlikely to be able to roll those into one, but you could get an expert and then somebody who's experienced something. So obviously you can't ask me any questions right now, but when we return to class, certainly if you have any questions, please feel free to address them then. So I hope to see you soon, and have a good day.